Good morning. So here's a question. Do you have a good education? Have you had a good education? What is a good education? These are all related questions. Most people, especially if they're an adult, probably will say, hey, I went through high school, I have a college degree or a few or something like that. And they might think that that answers the question. But some people can't answer what exactly is an education or what is a liberal education. Now, here's a few contrasts between two different types of education. Mortimer Adler did some work in the 30s and 40s up until his death, um, talking about what he called real or true liberalism versus false liberalism, which was basically a type of fascist program that was rising in the 30s and 40s. But you may be surprised that we may, as 30, 40, 50-year-old people, we may receive more of a fascist education rather than a true liberal arts education, as Mortimer Adler described it. So here's some contrasts, and you be the judge whether or not you had an education. Here's some differences between a true liberal education from a false liberal education. And liberal, don't think of the political liberal. That's not exactly what we're talking about. Liberal really connects to the word like free. You are freed from something, and a true liberal education is about freeing you. And these differences that I'll contrast will help key us into what a true education in the true liberal sense means. First difference is liberal education develops the authority of reason, okay, the authority of reason, but false liberal education develops the authority of a state or a party or a group, okay? So you see the difference. The authority of reason basically means that you're an independent thinker and you can think through arguments. You can weigh premises, see how those premises fit together, and see whether the conclusion fits with what you understand of the world. That's independent. It encourages you to challenge authority, which is maybe illegitimate authority. So, for instance, when someone is doing something in the name of something else and is actually doing the exact opposite of what they're supposed to be doing, malfeasance, so a police officer who's not actually protecting and serving, doing something else, or an elected official, somebody that has a specific mandate, but they're doing something other than that mandate, or even the government itself. Maybe the government has somehow become tyrannical. Now, the liberated person is encouraged and cultivated to question authority, okay? Not in the sense because they're anti-authority, but they want to know, is this a legitimate authority? Because if it's not, then it needs to be resisted in some form. Second difference, liberal education develops freedom of the person from the passions, okay, and from the state. So two tyrannies are discussed when you're looking at Adler's discussion of liberal education. The first tyranny is the tyranny of the self. You are subjected to a type of tyranny if you can't tell the difference between your passions and reasoning. If you don't have the self-discipline to tell the difference between your emotional appetites from your reasonable, like how an argument flows, whether an argument has force on you or not, whether you like it or not. But these are different, and it takes training and cultivation. Now, liberal education develops freedom from tyranny of the passions so that reason could be in control rather than the passions. It's self-discipline. Secondly, a liberal education helps you to be free from the tyranny of the state. Now, this is a big contrast between the false liberalism or fascist liberalism, which is not true liberalism, in the sense that the false liberalism cultivates the passions for the service of the party or the state or the institution that's being taught. Now, think about the difference. One would stoke the passions so that it can get you to do something, what it wants. And it may actually cultivate this sense of virtue, this sense of if you're doing this, you're a good person, and anybody that's not doing this is a bad person. Okay, but as I've mentioned in other talks, especially when we talk about logic and fallacies, anytime that you are your baser instincts, us versus them, or entitlement, or hate, strong things that appeal to your your baser impulses, anything that's stoking those things, you should be very wary of. Okay, so one tries to get freedom over the tyranny of the self by making sure the passions are subordinate to reason. The other ones are happy to stoke the passions in service to their cause. Okay, so if there's a specific party that's stoking your passions, and it doesn't want you to question its own legitimacy, it only wants to focus on the other, that is definitely an illiberal way to go. It's not cultivating freedom from the passions, it's actually encouraging it for their own purposes. Third difference, liberal education emphasizes unity above division. Okay, but false liberalism emphasizes division for motivating passions. Like I said before, um, some groups of people will actually emphasize division as somehow emphasizing these differences will somehow come to some type of unity. It doesn't actually make sense if you think about it, but that's the point. You don't need to think about it critically if it's all about passions. And in fact, if you can set it up where it's like if you question this, you're automatically in this bad camp. Then it'll make you feel guilty because you want to be part of this group that says it's in service of all that's good and light and etc. And if you are on this other side, obviously you're a bad person. It doesn't want you to critically analyze it. It wants you to be critical of others without being self-critical. Okay. Now, here's some tests that we can actually apply. Some questions basically to help stimulate our thoughts. Okay. What can you question? Okay, find a party or a group or an institution you're a part of and start asking questions. If you feel uncomfortable with asking questions, that's a red flag. Why can't you ask these certain questions? So our liberal education encourages you to ask questions. That doesn't mean you're being disrespectful, but it's basically says truth is more important than conformity with other people. Truth is more important than friendship. Goodness is more important. And if we all believe that, then we can all have these discussions. If we don't, just like my other videos about rational discussion, you have to have a higher unity so that we could go over those divides. We can transcend those divides if we have a unity. Liberal education provides that. It focuses on truth and goodness, justice. We have something that's a transcendently higher thing that we could focus on. That's the reason why we can transcend divisions, because we have a higher standard. Okay. Another question. Do you believe that feeling is more important than reasoning? Okay, if feeling is more important than everything else, that's a big red flag. Could it be something that's just a personal position you develop? Maybe. But if you look, be self-critical here. If people are always talking about feelings and feelings determine reality rather than reality determining other things, then that's a red flag. A related question, what rules you? Is it passions or principles? Now, everybody wants you to think on whichever group you may associate yourself with. They always want to say that they're the people of principle, right? But you have to analyze your life. Are you motivated by principles or not? And that's not to say all your principles are perfectly right, but knowing that there's a difference between passions and principles, that's a big question. Next, does your party, group, or tribe seek understanding, or is it compliance? You have to practically look at that. If you're asking questions that challenge what they're saying, what's the reaction? Is it compliance, or is it understanding? Is it a response with like, hey, that's a great question. This is the reason why we say it. Is the answer filled with fallacious reasoning, wrong appeals, or is the reasoning invalid? Okay, so these are some things. Now, this is just a very brief primer of liberal education, and maybe it's like practical components. You have to do your own research. You have to do your own self-analysis. But this is a start. Liberal education, I'm afraid that most of us have not actually had one unless you went to a specific school that was dedicated to it. Most of the universities, in my experience, have the word liberal education in the name, but that doesn't mean you actually get a liberal education. It doesn't just mean have a bunch of classes that makes you well-rounded. It doesn't just mean you're exposed to a bunch of different ideas. That's not really what liberal education is. Liberal education is more than just being bombarded with all kinds of different views. That's not the case. Okay. If you go to my website, commonphilosopher.com, there are a few articles related to Mortimer Adler. He wrote on this. And what's interesting about Mortimer Adler is he was writing in the 30s and 40s. He continued writes until later in the century. But he was writing at the very beginning when World War II was basically kicking off, and his fears about fascism, in contrast to what he called true liberal education, this was before the present day. So a lot of his were fears about things that were happening then, and my worry is that most of his fears have actually happened in the educational front. So, all right, some last minute some comments. The false liberalism or fascism cultivates a party identity. Okay, it's always about party. It's always about some identity, some group identity. It's always about that. And it's also divisive, your group versus another group. It's always about that. It's not a transcendent unity. It's about a division between us versus them. Always about identities, groups. Okay, liberal education makes you an independent thinker. Okay, so that means if you believe something, it's because you have wrestled with the issues. You have went through the premises and see how those inferences connect and how the conclusion matters and how the conclusion fits with the rest of your worldview system. You've done that work. That's what liberal education is about. It's freeing you from groupthink. It's freeing you from propaganda. It's freeing you from your own passions to help discipline your mind so that you can actually be autonomous. Okay. So the two tyrannies, it helps fight against that, the tyranny of the self and the tyranny of the state against the citizen. Now, this is a lot. This is a lot of stuff. But check out my website if you think this is worthwhile. Follow me. There's different mechanisms, the notification, stuff like that. But if this is worthwhile, then stay tuned. I'll have more videos and check out my website. And you guys have a great weekend.